Right, welcome to the Living Well podcast, presented by Elim Christian Centre. It's Mental Health Awareness Week, and over this week, our goal is to discuss some topics that will hopefully bring some clarity around some of the real issues that we face in life. Now, in today's issue, we're discussing stress, what it is, how it affects us, how we deal with it. My name is Mike Griffiths. I'm part of the pastoral and counselling team here at Elim, and it is my great privilege to be joined today by Dr. Lehan Stemmet. He's a researcher, speaker, author, podcaster, consultant, dad, husband, all-round extremely good bloke. Lehan, it's wonderful to have you with us today. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work?
Well, thanks, Mike, for that intro. It's quite, I don't think I've ever been introduced like that. It's a great intro.
Let's hope it's all up from here.
Let's hope we live up to the expectations.
That's it.
So a bit about me is I've been on an interesting journey career-wise. So just some background, because it sort of lands where we're going to, what we're going to talk about is I've got a background in biochemistry. I understand the physiology and all of that of stress very well. We can maybe touch on some of the genetics. But ultimately, it's about what do we do with all that knowledge? How do we use it? And the reason why I became interested in this topic called stress is not so much because of the topic of stress. What made me interested in it is it's such a topic that encapsulates so much of being human. So it touches on the physiology, it touches on the genetics, it touches on psychology and spirituality as well. So that's what I really became interested in. The real passion for it is I saw the limitation stress puts on people in becoming the best that they can possibly be. So for me, that was the real thing, is what stands in the way of people becoming the best they can be.
See, now that's really interesting, right? Because most of us think stress is something that's good and it pushes us to produce, but what I'm hearing you saying is that actually stress, uncontrolled, is a significant limiting factor in people's full expression.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And so, I think that's probably a nice way to couch the conversation as well. And maybe first up, we start with the difference between pressure and stress.
Great.
So many people would have heard the terms good stress and bad stress. And so we still have this thing living in society that there's good stress and bad stress, even academic circles. And even the International Stress Management Association, the peak body for stress management research, they also say there is no such thing as good stress.
Wow.
So they kind of also divide it in the same way that I look at it, is there's a difference between stress, which is a demand to perform. That's the thing that helps you to become better. Mm-hmm. And then stress, which is there's no such thing as good stress. Okay. So maybe that's the first way we landed, is we need to distinguish between pressure, which is just, hunger is pressure, starvation is stress. So when you're feeling hungry, that's pressure on your system. So you go, I've got to do something about it. I need to make a meal. When you're starving, that's stress on your system that is not sustainable. It's not good. So it's almost like you can say when your ability to cope with the pressure becomes more than you can handle.
Very good.
That will be stress.
Very good.
And quite often, so we'll know from a counseling perspective as well, anxiety is something that's uncontrollable. So that will be the next level.
Very good.
Next level up. So maybe that's the way to land it.
Okay, so pressure. Pressure is actually a better descriptor of a lot of what we talk about as stress.
Yeah.
But a positive pressure is a good thing. You've got jobs to get done, timelines to work to, deadlines to meet. But when does pressure become stress?
When your ability and your resources to deal with what you need to deal with and to sort out the point of pressure, or to, so we call in an organizational psychology perspective, they use the job demands resources model, like model. So that's one way to explain it. So the job, the demand, and the resources, whether it's your own resources or company resources, doesn't match up. Yeah, that's when it could lead to stress. Okay. And also, so even when we talk within the context of stress, you've got the short term, the acute stress and the chronic stress. The acute stress response in your body is not problematic at all. It's the chronic one, the long term, and we can talk about what creates the long term stress on your system that leads to all sorts of other challenges as well.
Yep. So things like adrenal fatigue, the long term effect of cortisol in the brain,
all that stuff. Okay. Yeah.
All right. Great.
Yeah.
All right. Well, one of the things that I've heard you mention is the difference between normalizing and destigmatizing.
Yeah. Okay.
Can you tell us a bit about that?
So that's a very good way to also think about, let's say, because it's Mental Health Awareness Week, one of the terms that I often hear people say is we want to destigmatize mental health, but quite often what they mean is destigmatize it. What they say is we want to normalize it. There's a big difference between the two.
Very good.
So normalizing means it's okay to be depressed. It's okay to have anxiety. It's like although it is inevitable that people might eventually experience some level of it at some point in their life, we don't want to normalize that because it's not the normal state of functioning. So there's a big difference between normalizing something and destigmatizing. So what we want to achieve is to say, well, let's destigmatize it when people have depression. And the only way to do it is to have discussions about it, to talk about it, to acknowledge when you are struggling with something. And I mean, you'll also know from your experience in counseling and pastoral care that there's a pathway to when something becomes a clinical problem.
Totally.
Like anything from feeling depressed to having depression.
Yes.
So that's the kind of thing we want to talk about. Is feeling depressed is not a bad thing. Having depression is not a bad thing, but it's not an optimal thing.
Yes,
and that's the destigmatization we're talking about. We don't want to normalize that state of functioning, but we do want to destigmatize it.
Great. And so today, talking about stress, we want to destigmatize stress. It happens. It happens to all of us at some point. We need to be able to talk about it to find a way through it.
Yeah.
But while pressure is a normal and can be a healthy form of demand, as you put it, once we are starting to get into a stress state, it's not good.
Yeah, especially the prolonged stress. So we don't want to go into too much detail around the mechanics of it, but basically what happens is these things that people call stress hormones, and you mentioned one of them, cortisol. Cortisol is probably the most problematic one of them all. Adrenaline is not such a big issue because your body secretes it and it metabolizes it, and then that's the end of it. As soon as the pressure is gone, it's the chronic secretion of cortisol in your system that is the problem in the long term from a hormonal perspective, because it affects, for example, your immune system. It suppresses your immune system. So that naturally has all sorts of other consequences as well. It affects brain growth. It even affects repair of chromosomes. So people who have higher levels of stress, chronic stress, and they don't deal with those things effectively, their body simply cannot repair the chromosomes and keep them stable. So basically they look older than they really are.
Is that what happened to me?
I don't know, Mike. You tell me.
So what I'm hearing though is that the consequences of allowing stress to remain unaddressed become increasingly problematic.
Yeah.
As it goes from acute to chronic, as it becomes a long-term way of living, and that some of the hormones involved actually, while their original intent and design was to help us, if that is a prolonged state, it actually really starts to do damage to us. Yeah. So what I'm hearing, Lehan, is that actually stress is a big deal. We've got to deal with this in our lives.
We do need to deal with that. And I think it's probably about not dealing with the stress so much as it's about dealing with what causes it in the first place and really understanding what sits behind this. So, once again, one of the things that I find quite interesting, and I use it for myself as well, is the principle of a thought leads to an emotion, and an emotion leads to behavior, and behavior leads to a consequence. Yeah. And so if you put that in reverse, the question to ask is that the consequence I want or outcome? Is that the best thing that could possibly happen in my life? And if it's not, then you have to go in reverse and say, well, what's the thought that I need to change in order to change the outcome? The trouble with that sometimes is we do get to a state where it's very hard to change the way you think, right?
And especially like if you're in a work environment,
very
you're
hard,
carrying a bunch of pressure, maybe you've got a largish job, and you are finding yourself increasingly wound up, can't shut it down. 1 o'clock at night, you're still in bed ruminating, going over things. And like at some level, I've got to change something. Like the old adage, if you don't change something, nothing will change. Yep. And yet the mechanics of how to actually do that, especially if you're fatigued, especially if you're, like you said before, subpar, suboptimal, it just can seem insurmountable, right?
Yeah. And I think for those things, so we can maybe move on later on to so what do you put in your toolbox for that? But we do need to plan for those instances where life does get too much. So another thing I'll add to that is changing the thought to change the emotion is even harder when it's underpinned by a specific belief system. So that's tracing it even further back, right? So if you go, what's the belief system that leads to that automatic thought that leads to that emotion? And so one of the things I found very helpful over the years is I've got a bunch of people that I can call. So let's say it doesn't have to be related to mental health, but it could be related to a difficult decision that I need to make at work, for example. So I'd say, who are the best people who can help me to just reflect on what the situation is, what's the best decision? Where my thinking is at about this call,
great.
so that it doesn't lead to something that
great.
is worse, right? So you kind of put things in place that helps you to make the right decisions, whatever that might be. So it's more prevention than it is dealing with the stressful outcome of it. It's kind of like, well, does it have to lead to that in the first place?
Yeah. So there's kind of two parts to this, right? One is, what do I do about if I'm in a deeply stressed place? What do I do about that at one level? But I'm not going to fix it long term unless we can get to the bottom of some of our thinking, feelings, and like you said, even earlier, core beliefs. So, I mean, that's classic CBT stuff, right? So obviously we're talking about having not just friends, but also trained counsellors who can help if you're in that place. Lehan, I want to ask you, you've studied this, you are an expert in this field. What's your personal experience with stress? You had any tough times? Share a story.
Yeah, should I lie down on the couch now when you do a Freud on me?
Let's do it.
Right, let's go. So, I mean, my personal story. So, I'm not going to give you too much detail. I don't think we've got time, and I'm happy to share more with people. Sure. So we can go back all the way to childhood. So, as a child, I was sexually abused. So, so that kind of creates something in your life, and there was no support, no help, none of that, and that creates a certain tension in your life. But what was interesting is what really created the tension was the threats that I received, the manipulation that I received. And that sticks with you because you start thinking, well, what's caused this? What did I do to lead to this? And all that kind of thing as well. So moving on is, I think that's probably one of the levels of inspiration that I eventually thought, well, what can I do with this situation? I have to deal with it anyway. Yeah. And what I found over the years is the best thing for me to do is to figure out exactly what I need to do to deal with what I need to deal with. And the important part was it wasn't just about me. I always needed to seek a purpose that's beyond me. Very good. And that purpose was, someone else is going through this as well. What can I do to make their life a little bit easier if they go through something similar? Because I always believe you've got to look for something that's a purpose or a direction or a mission that's higher than the situation that you're in. So that's, I think, part of my personal experience with this. And then, of course, you think about more minor things like being in leadership roles, which you'll be very familiar with. Being in leadership roles when organizations go through major change, when things like COVID happen and you've got to deal with the changes in your organization, the changes to people's lives, dealing with things you've never dealt with before. So all of that can create an enormous amount of pressure. Yes. But what I've found over the years is you put the right team around you, you put a strategy around these things, you openly communicate it. And in the Christian context, for me, it's always about, we can, as a scientist, you want to always think about things rationally. You want to rely on intellect, you want to rely on facts, you want to rely on figures and research. But what I've realized over the years is that's just our ability to think and to reason. An element that we often forget about is something you can call it revelation. So revelation doesn't happen within anybody. Revelation comes from God. So there's always an element of, sometimes I've just got to hand this over and see what happens.
Wow, I love it.
Right?
Yeah, great. Come on.
And I'd say 100% of the time, that's been one of the main things that really tilted things in a way that I could get insights into a problem that comes to a solution that there was no way I could foresee that. There's no way I could explain that. And I've just learned over the years that that's kind of my go-to place now. It's like, I'll do what I can do. You plan for what you can plan for. And then there's always this element of, okay, so some things I'm just going to go, let's just hand it over. Wait it out for 24 hours. Don't make a decision now, and then something comes your way.
See,
right?
This is fascinating, man. Because you're a doctorate, you're a scientist, and yet what I'm hearing you saying is that actually the Christian life affords us something that is and can be profoundly helpful in dealing with pressure, dealing with stress. The recognition that God is actually involved in this, and that if we can build into the way we do life room for God, He will help us.
He will. Well, He'll send a person to you. He'll send a thought your way that I know for a fact those thoughts don't come from me.
Yeah, lovely.
There's no way I've got that level of insight. There's no way I've ever dealt with, like, let's say COVID, for example. There's no way I've ever dealt with a COVID situation where we've got to go through a process where we have to help people through redundancies. We don't know. And then these plans come. And so I'll maybe just add the organization I work for is still going, getting stronger. We've launched new products. There's a whole bunch of stuff we've done during a time when most people said, are you going to survive this? And I was like, well, that's not really the question, is it? The question is, how will we survive this? And I think that those sort of strategies that you put in place The other thing I'd maybe add to this is anything you do within a stress context. So let's talk about coping strategies, right? Anything you do within a stress context, quite often the go-to strategy for people is to use something we call avoidance coping. I've done a ton of research around avoidance coping, and it doesn't work.
Great.
Right? It doesn't work at all. And I think there are different elements to avoidance coping as well. So
hold on, I've got to stop you there. This is big, man. Like,
it is.
Because for most of us, at some level, avoidance it's kind of one of the strategies in the toolbox. It's like, walk away, let's just not go there. And whether that's, a long-term chronic avoidance of anything that's problematic in our lives, or whether it's a short-term solution, what you're saying is avoidance does not work. It does not solve anything.
No.
Okay.
And maybe be more specific. It specifically is maladaptive avoidance. So maladaptive avoidance is when that's your go-to for any problem.
Yes.
So there's all sorts of consequences. Not only, and I want to land this within the context of why is it important to have strategies. If you look at maladaptive avoidance, that's when it's your go-to strategy for every problem.
Yes.
Sometimes you got to avoid certain things. So for example, emotional avoidance of a specific traumatic event at the time is useful if it helps you to focus on what you need to get done in the moment.
Great.
But if you don't go back to dealing with those emotions later on in life, that's the maladaptive avoidance. The problem with maladaptive avoidance is you don't deal with the problem you've got to deal with. The second problem with it is you don't grow. And that's the bigger issue that I wanted to address is the more you deal with problems that you should be dealing with and successfully deal with them, the more confidence you build and you build your repertoire of coping strategies.
Very good.
So that I also say is coming back to the point where sometimes you do need to pray and just rely on God. Is the more you do it and the more you see that working out in a good way, the more you develop the confidence that that is a good way to go forward.
Yes.
So confidence is a big part of this. And actually, the research around stress and confidence is also quite powerful. Okay. There's some interesting anecdotal research that confidence helps to build more receptors in your brain to cancel out the stress response.
Wow, interesting.
So that's an interesting anecdotal piece of research. Yes. I wouldn't say that's a fact at this stage, but there's interesting research that's what happens at a physiological level.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of research that shows that confident people deal with stress better.
So confidence coming from not avoiding our problems, but engaging with them, finding ways to work through them. And as a result of that, when we face a similar thing again, we kind of have got some skills this time. So our confidence is higher. Yeah. And what you're saying is that actually changes our brain structure and enables us to be more confident going forward and be more resilient to stress.
Yep, exactly. And I think that's probably where the action comes from. So if we go back to what we talked about earlier, where the thought leads to the emotion, leads to the behavior, leads to the outcome. So sometimes if you struggle to change the thought or the emotion, we need to change the behavior. And the reason why changing behavior is useful because it puts you in another state or another place. Right. And quite often, I've actually got a photo that I showed people years ago of me standing in the city somewhere, and it's a photo of a building, and you can only see the building. And then all I did is I just shifted a little bit to the right, and now you can see the sky tower behind the building. Lovely. And the point I made to them is that's just a shift in behavior. That gives me a new perspective. I can see something that I couldn't see before, and that relates to the thought. So you can't think about something when you're stressed, but you can behave differently. Yeah. And there's a lot of research around the impact of behavior on the way your brain is wired, as much as there is on the way that you think that wires your brain. Yes. Right. So behavior is also quite a strong way to change attitudes.
So this is the field of epigenetics, right?
Epigenetics, I'd say, yep, it does relate to that as well.
And one of the things we mentioned earlier too was that the issues with stress and their impact, it's not just mental, is it? No. Like we were talking about the developments in the last 20 years in terms of a metabolic or mitochondrial understanding of what. Do you want to we don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, but just give us a little bit of an idea of where that research is going now with regard to stress.
It's fascinating. Eh? So there's been a lot of research around mitochondria. So just to maybe land that for people, is mitochondria are the little energy generators in your cells. You've got them in every cell that requires energy. So mitochondria is a very it's essential to metabolism, it's essential to energy, and essentially energy is essential to what we do. Like you can't, if you don't have energy, and we can go down that track as well because rest is important in dealing with stress and resilience, right? So mitochondria, there's been a lot of research around mitochondria and its function. And only in recent years, some psychiatrists have actually gone through and looked at all the different sources of research and pulled them together and said, this is interesting. And maybe to put that on a more practical level is, one psychiatrist specifically looked at this, and what he discovered, now I mean this, I don't want to give people false hope, but what this guy discovered is one of his patients, and you'll know, Mike, that schizophrenia is one of the more serious.
This is Chris Palmer, isn't it? Dr. Chris Palmer.
Chris Palmer is the guy. So one of his patients had schizophrenia, but also was obese, and he wanted to lose weight, so he put him on a ketogenic diet.
Yeah, intriguing.
And that guy, the symptoms of the schizophrenia started to subside over the years. So he started looking.
It actually started to subside over months.
Yes,
and it's extraordinary.
Very extraordinary because it's one of the harshest, most difficult diagnoses to make, and very hard to treat as well.
Yeah.
And so that's when he started digging into this. So basically, what they've discovered over the years in different sources is mitochondria is essential to mental health. And so that you can then distinguish between, well, if someone has a mental health condition or illness, what makes it a condition versus an experience. So if somebody feels depressed versus when somebody has depression.
Yeah.
And I'd say maybe for people to think about that is when there's a reason why you feel depressed, that's probably not depression. That's probably feeling depressed about something, right?
Very good.
But when you have no reason why you think you should feel anxious or depressed, that tends to be something that you definitely need to go and see somebody about. You know, you can see counselors, mentors, and so forth when you're dealing with something in life, because that's the plan, is people help you to develop coping skills, but then you move into the more serious conditions.
So this is interesting.
And stress does lead to those things. So maybe just land it within the context of this podcast, is stress is the number one predictor of mental illness and physiological illnesses, right? Number one. Number two, therefore, the biggest predictor of stress is something called rumination. So we can dig into that if you want.
Well, I think this is great, right? Because let's go to the person who's stressed.
Right.
I've been stressed plenty of times in my life, and I've had some pretty tough. Found myself depressed, found myself suicidal, even as a relatively high-functioning person within, the field that I have engaged in. And that's been quite shocking. And to be in that place and to be unable to get out of it, or feel like you're unable to get out of it. And, because I tend to think that I can work my way out of most problems. The problem with that is then I go, well, I'm not working hard enough. That's the problem. I've got to work harder in order to get out of this. And of course, that doesn't solve anything. Yeah. And so as part of that, then it seems like you lose the ability to not only regulate your emotions, but to be able to control your thinking.
Yeah.
And I find this when I'm talking to people again and again, people who get really stressed, who get, have conditions that start to move towards depression, anxiety, those sorts of things. What they're shocked by is that they have intrusive thoughts that they can't control anymore. Yeah. And you roll that out through your day, and now it's evening and you can't turn off work, and now you're lying in bed trying to get to sleep, and now you are ruminating. So talk to us about ruminating.
So the problem with rumination is, when we spoke a little bit earlier, we alluded to behavior that changes the way that your brain is wired and thinking that changes the way that you're wired. Rumination is an emotional response, but it's a negative emotional response. And what it does is, because you're ruminating through an emotion via thoughts, your brain starts to make those connections, and that's the natural way to think about something. And then that often becomes a belief system as well, or it's the belief that drives it. So the specifics around how that works kind of varies from person to person. But it becomes very difficult to change that then. And rumination has been shown over and over again as the number one predictor. I didn't believe it when I saw it the first time, and then I did my own research because I'm a skeptical scientist, and I found that in all samples I looked at, it predicted self-harm, it predicted anxiety, it predicted depression, physiological symptoms of psychological distress.
Wow, so this is rumination. This is like
rumination.
One of the behavioral responses coming from an ongoing chronic stress situation actually is connected to these unbelievably negative outcomes.
That's it. And it's Mark Twain always used to say it's the worst things that never happened. Yeah. Right? Or it's believing things that might or might not happen. So to take rumination a bit further, just because it's such an important aspect of stress,
Can we just define rumination quickly?
So rumination is a negative response to things that either happened or didn't happen.
And it's the ongoing
what if,
rethinking
only,
and
should have,
rethinking.
could have, all those sorts of questions that people ask, right? So I then looked at, well, can you ruminate about the future and as well as the past? Because Freud taught us that everything comes from the past. And the interesting thing was, we could when I say this, I mean my research colleagues and I, so I was the research leader on this, but we split up rumination into two directions, ruminating about the future things and ruminating about things in the past or of the past. And between those two, the biggest predictor of all of the psychological and physiological negative consequences was ruminating about the future, which
makes
contradicted what Freud said.
Okay, interesting.
But the interesting thing is what we then discovered is the way that the future or the past comes into that equation is people are concerned that whatever happened in the past happens again in the future.
I see.
Yeah, so you are ruminating about the future, and the past, yes, you might be worried about, but you're not thinking about the past as the past because that's happened. You're concerned, what do I do if that happens again?
Right.
Because that was horrible, right?
And so this leads us right down the anxiety track, right? Because anxiety tends to be more future-focused, depression more past-focused. So this is just a recipe for someone finding themselves in a whole world of mental challenge.
Very much. And rumination, I think, it's just the data that I've seen over the years consistently predicts all of that.
Yeah.
So then you go, well, what's the opposite of rumination? And the opposite of rumination is meditation, prayer, worship. It's the same concept, but it's about positive things, about good things.
Wow, that's interesting.
Right, so it creates positive emotions, positive thoughts, positive outcomes, whereas rumination is thinking the same things over and over, but it's negative things.
Right.
Yeah.
Very good.
So
that's interesting. I've got very strong memories of past seasons in my life involved in high leadership roles, dealing with issues that I had not had experience or training in, but because I'm the guy at the top of the tree, I'm the guy who's responsible for it. Facing threats that potentially not only necessarily threaten my job, but threaten the credibility of our organization, and lying in bed hour after hour after hour. Well, if this happens, I'll have to do this. And then if this happens, what would I do about that? And all it does is it increases your exhaustion.
It does.
Which lowers your resources, which means that when you're dealing with the pressure, you've got less ability to deal with that, right? So it reduces your resiliency.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about resilience.
So
what makes someone resilient to stress?
That's it's an interesting question, and the reason why I like that question, the way you phrased it, is because it leads to what's the definition of it. So quite often what I come across in the workshops I run and so on with people, or just one-on-one conversations, is people's interpretation of resilience is what I would call tenacity or endurance.
Very good.
So they think it means I can be more tough-minded or I can endure more. So I can do more. I mean, earlier you talked about work harder. So people often think, well, I should be able to work harder. And quite often when I speak to organizations, they would say, well, we wanted you to do something to our people about becoming more resilient. And I said, why? And they'd say things like, well, we want them to be able to withstand more. And I'd go, that's not resilience, because what you need to teach people is when to rest and how to recover, because that's where the resilience sits.
So
it's the recovery, right?
This goes right into the whole production mindset, right? Like we've just got to produce more.
Yeah.
What I'm hearing you saying is no. What we've actually got to do is we've got to be better, be healthier.
Absolutely.
It's not about becoming resilient so we can produce more. There's actually probably no issue with what we're producing.
No.
It's just how we're handling the pressure that we're under. Man, this ties into all sorts of things, right? It ties into Sabbath. It ties into being a good leader who does not load up my people.
That's it.
With stuff that actually I would never put on myself. So then, that's exactly what Jesus was criticizing the Pharisees for, right? You tie up burdens and put them on other people's backs, and you do not lift a finger to help them.
Yeah.
It's interesting, the thought that Pharisaic perspective could actually apply to some of our leadership and management, both outside the church as well as inside.
Yeah, and that's an interesting line of conversation, Mike, because I think for me that also touches on something called moral distress. So there's the moral distress, or there's the moral burden, or there's the burden of guilt. You can call it whatever. Okay. So moral distress, guilt, it's the same thing. So quite often I think in the 21st century, we're confusing morality with ethics, with law, with guilt.
Wow.
And so the question is, are we feeling guilty about the right thing? So for example, if someone in an office environment says, you must have heard about this presenteeism. So you're at the office, but you're not really doing anything, right?
Okay,
You're at
I
the
haven't heard of
office.
this,
So it's
but
called
yeah.
presenteeism is
Okay.
kind of the opposite of absenteeism,
Oh, yeah.
which is one of the signs of psychological distress. So people spend more time at the office, but the output doesn't change. In fact, it goes down.
Wow, yeah.
So presenteeism would be one of those, because you might say, well, are you one of the clock watchers? You come in at 8:30, you leave at 4:30, and so people end up staying longer, and then that becomes a bad habit. It leads to other consequences. And it's because we're feeling guilty. The question is, what are you feeling guilty about? And should you rather take the break? Should you rather rest? And is the input better? And one of the things I often joke about is the productivity issue in New Zealand. I don't think we've got a productivity issue
Very good.
at all. I think people work extraordinarily hard. I think taking the Pharisee view on that is, I think there's an awful lot of bureaucracy and laws and regulations that doesn't lead to a better output. So what you refer to as the burden that the Pharisees put onto people to say, well, here's some more things that you've got to comply with, and if you don't, we're going to point it out. And the question was, well, what value does it add to the actual output, the actual outcome? And I think from a resilience perspective, that's important, because we have to prioritize. You have to think, well, what value does this really add to myself, to my family, to my society? And it's a question I really ask myself quite often, multiple times a day, is what I'm thinking, feeling, and doing helping me or anybody else in any way? And if it's not, what will I think? What will I feel? What will I do that is helpful?
This is really interesting. I remember being on a panel once, in fact, it was the lead pastors here at Elim Christian Centre. And it was at a combined staff meeting, and we were just having a bit of a get open, honest, and vulnerable time. And I was asked one of the first questions. It was a completely random thing. And the question was, what is one of the most difficult things you find in pastoral leadership? And my response just came. I didn't even think about it.
Yeah.
My answer was, it's the guilt.
Yeah, okay. Yep.
It's the constant, incessant guilt. Am I working hard enough? Am I getting enough done? Should I be more available for people? Am I looking after my wife? Am I looking after my children? And in that whole thing, looking after self is the thing that gets pushed to the very bottom all the time.
Yeah.
So what I'd like to do, Lehan, is I'd like to kind of bring this back full circle again. Let me be the hypothetical person who is stressed.
Right.
And I am, like I'm facing pressure, but we've identified that pressure in and of itself, that's okay, that's normal, that comes in every area of life. But I am now stressed, and I know I'm stressed, and my productivity, like you just mentioned, is decreasing. My mental clarity is not good. My behaviors at home, in the car, there's something wrong. What do I do? Where do I go? What are we talking about?
So I'll maybe land it first. I often talk to people about, you've got to have building tools, repair tools, and maintenance tools.
Oh, no,
well, actually,
this is great.
You've got to have building tools, and then you've got to have maintenance tools, and then you've got to have repair tools, right?
This is great. I haven't heard it delineated like that before.
The reason why I talk about building tools, maintenance tools, and repair tools is, first of all, before we even get to the point where we're in that state, it's very good to decide what is, we can talk in a Christian context, we can talk about what are my gifts and what are my talents. And so that leads to, well, what is it that you then build? That's what the building tools are for. And so then build those things, put those resources and tools around us. Then once you've built it, you've also got to think, well, something I need to do to maintain this. Like, you need to oil it, you need to grease it, you need to clean it, you need to de-rust it. What is that? Well, it depends on what you've built. So I can't give people a specific set of tools, but I can give people a framework for it. Really, you need, I'd say, before we can get to that point, is really understand your, might go your purpose. Think about the purpose that you have rather than your purpose. There's a purpose that we all have. There's gifts that we've got, and there's talents that we've got. And then we build something around us, get the maintenance tools in place. And then when things go wrong, we have to have some maintenance, some repair tools in place as well. That's your counselors, your psychologists, your, all of the people who can help you, medical people and so forth. But we don't want to get to that point. So when you look at the mental health continuum, I think there's a lot we can do with education to help people to understand, how do I know where I'm at to prevent myself from going into the mental illness side where stress really gets too much. So I'd say that's the first step, is before we get to that point, is put some things in place. When you are so stressed, talking to people who are a little bit further along the line, who have dealt with this thing before,
really
very, very helpful. Talking to people, praying about something, and just take a break. That's why I keep saying sometimes we have to behave ourselves out of the thought or the emotion. You might feel like I need to do more. My point is, this is the time when you have to force yourself to behave yourself out of that and force yourself to go and take the break, whatever the break might be. Sleep, spend some time with family, unless they're the reason for stress. Go to the gym, exercise, build those routines into our lives as well. And it's amazing what people can do when you find the resources around you. People can just maybe hold your hand. We don't want to get to the point where we stress too much. That's, I think, the first point is don't get to that point in the first place.
So what's that point? Where's that point?
Oh, that's a tricky one. And I think people need to...
When do we need to go and get help?
If you know that you're going to deal with a problem you've never dealt with before, find those mentors.
Oh, okay. So really preemptive, get out in front of it.
Absolutely. And so let's say, for example, I step into a leadership role and I know that in that leadership role, I'm going to be expected to operate at a level of financial management that I've never operated on before.
Yes.
I'd go and find myself a mentor who can help me with that, right?
Excellent.
So you get to that point where I know that, first of all, they prepare me for what I'm going to see, and then I have someone to go to when I see something.
Excellent.
So that's one way to do that. I think mentors are incredibly powerful people for us to work with, and it doesn't have to be the same person. You could have a mentor for finance. You could have a mentor for being a better parent, and they come and go, right? So that's one step. The other thing is, as I said, build time for rest. The biggest issue we have in stress is people don't rest enough. Yeah, I think you're going to talk at some point. You're going to talk about sleep. Sleep is such an underrated part of being resilient. Rest, sleep, proper sleep, not long sleep, proper sleep.
Yeah, very good.
Find those times to rest. I cannot emphasize that enough. I think a lot of people just ignore the value of rest. Other people might talk about mindfulness. It's like, well, our minds are pretty much always full of something. You just need to decide what am I going to focus on, and that's nothing different to focusing on the right things. For example, I'd also say the opposite of rumination: meditate, pray, worship. When you're feeling that you're in that state of stress, that's one of the ways we can take a break as well. See things in perspective is the number one coping strategy. So rumination is not a coping strategy. Rumination is an emotional response. But the number one consistent coping strategy is seeing things in perspective. So the psychological language calls it detached coping, but it just means seeing things in perspective.
Stepping back from your problem.
Stepping back from the
problem.
Getting
a big picture look at it.
What does it look like?
Yeah.
What is this actually that I'm dealing with?
Yeah.
Will things really fall apart?
Yeah.
Has anybody else dealt with this before successfully? Have I? And this is why it's so important to not use avoidance coping, because at some point you'll look back and say, I've dealt with something like this before.
Excellent.
I got through this.
Excellent.
And this is how I got through it. So you kind of put a plan in place.
Yeah.
It's natural to feel shocked when you see something for the first time,
Yeah.
But then you kind of step back and go, just get some perspective. I've done this kind of thing before. We got through it okay. This is what I've done to do it, and then do it.
See, that's great because we all have achieved some stuff. We've all worked through stuff. We all actually have far more coping strategies than we often think of when it comes to ourselves. And so I did some work with a client once when I basically got them to write their own book of Proverbs.
Yes, exactly.
Like, what are the lessons you've learned from your life that you can carry through, and then how do you apply those to the situations you're facing now?
And I think you're touching on an important thing. So as much as the psychological principle in the theme that you extract from all the different research is see things in perspective, there are ways that you do that. So one of them is writing things down.
Yeah, great.
It's a very powerful way. I mean, I've used that. It's such a simple technique, and people often go, well, what do you mean I need to write about it? But it could take all sorts of forms. You could say to someone, look, why don't you write a letter to someone about how they should deal with the thing that you're dealing with? And it's remarkable what level of wisdom comes when people start to write things down and they go, oh, well, I'm actually now doing this. It's interesting how that works for people.
Yeah, what advice would you give someone if they were in your shoes?
Yes.
That's really good. And again, that's that detachment, isn't it?
It's the detachment.
Perspective.
You're not in the situation. You're not writing about it for someone else to help them. And
great.
That's how people get to a solution.
So, Leon, what I'm hearing that there are some things we've really got to take note of and avoid. We've really got to avoid rumination.
Yeah.
That it's not about running away from pressure. Pressure is a normal part of life.
Yeah.
But when we are starting to get stressed, whatever we do, we mustn't avoid it. We mustn't allow ourselves to get into rumination. We do have to go to people, get help that we need. And we've got to actually stop. We've got to get some rest. We've got to get some sleep. We've got to allow our body to go from a stressed state back down to a normal baseline state where it can repair itself, where it can be clear on what it's doing, where it's easy to step back. I remember one time when I was probably at one of my worst points, and I actually drove into the church I was working for, and I don't know what it was. I just couldn't do it.
Yeah.
And so I just kept driving. Yeah. And I found myself 40 minutes later driving out of the city, having no idea where I was going, too embarrassed to call my wife to tell her what was happening to me, having no idea what was actually happening to myself, but knowing that it seemed that there was a very, very thin thread between me and sanity. And what I did was I found myself on a road towards a city, and I had a good mate who lived there. So I called him and said, buddy, I need some time. Can I come and catch up? And he said, yeah, of course you can. And so we sat at a cafe, and I just talked, and he just reflected back and gave me perspective. And that actually was the turnaround moment for me. And from there, I had to release some of my responsibilities. I had to prioritize rest and sleep at a whole different level and began to come out of it. I'm intrigued by the story of Elijah. Whether, the guy was dealing with stress, with a situation that was out of control. It's intriguing, isn't it, that he got to a point where arguably he was suicidal. He went off into the desert to die. And God didn't come down and reason with him. God fed him and said, sleep. Fed him again, sleep. Then he went for a wander through the desert for about 6 weeks. And then when God spoke to him, it was clear that his head still wasn't right. So then what's intriguing is that what God did was God started removing his responsibilities. All right, Elijah, go and appoint this person and appoint this person, and they'll do this and they'll finish what you've started. And it was like he took the load off. And I think sometimes we fool ourselves into thinking that there's a way through without removing any load.
And I was going, it's funny you go that way, because the example I quite often use to explain this to people is you have to leave some fat in the system. You have to leave some resource in the system as well, because you don't know when something bad might happen where it needs more resource. So I'd give them an elastic band, and I'd say, okay, well, stick as many things as you possibly can into that elastic band. And then I'd throw something at them like, well, here's a big thing that you didn't see coming. Where are you going to put that?
Yeah, great.
So that elastic band gives you the opportunity. The other thing that I'd also say that I like about what you've just talked about is the perspective. So coming back to perspective, quite often we forget the actions that God did to take things away from Elijah is to help him to be more effective in the main thing that he needed to do.
Very good.
And that's what I keep coming back to, is we've got to focus. So the layers of perspective we have in, let's say, Christianity is you can see things in the perspective of other big deals. But what if that's not effective if what you're going through is the biggest thing to go through? And there's a next layer of perspective as well. What's this thing in eternity?
Right.
Because I'm not going to live forever, and but most religions potentially have that view of eternity. The next layer is, well, what if I see this within the perspective of an almighty God? And it's like many religions have that as well. The problem is they've got an almighty vengeful God, and that doesn't work out well. We have an almighty loving God who will go to that extent where he says, look, I want you to do what I need you to do because it's going to be good for you as well, right? It's not just the mission. I can get someone else, is I think God's view is, but it's going to be good for you as well, and people need to hear this from you. But I'm going to take the lesser things away to focus on the bigger thing that you need to do.
That's really
good.
That
for me is very interesting because it aligns to something I see so often in people where they come and talk to me and say, I'm very stressed. And inevitably when we go through the conversation, because that's the secret, quite often people say, what do you say to people who are stressed? And I go, I don't say anything. I just listen. And they figure it out.
Very good.
And quite often what they say is, or what they begin with is, I'm so stressed. And what we get to in the end is, you're not stressed, you're frustrated. And the frustration relates to not doing what is your purpose.
Wow.
Right? And so you're doing all these things that the world expects you to do, but you're not doing the thing that you're supposed to do. They're very different, right? And I often talk to, so what we do then is, the way we then try to relax, because we're told to be mindful and to relax, is we try to find joy and happiness and satisfaction. And I often say, you find satisfaction you find in your body, joy you find in your soul, and happiness you find in your mind. But fulfillment you find when you align what you do with your mind, your body, and your spirit with the gift that you've been given. And I think quite often that's the issue we have, is we forget that there's actually, your purpose is not the job you do. The job you do allows you to fulfill a purpose. It could be that your job is in your purpose. Let's say it's ministry and that's your thing, right? But for many of us, we work in corporate environments and your job is not your purpose. The job allows you to fulfill the purpose, but you're not doing that thing.
Very good.
So that's the other
that's
element.
great.
I think it's really useful. And
it makes me think of Matthew 11, when Jesus says, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I'll give you rest." And he says, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me," which when you were saying it, I was just thinking, man, that's exactly what Jesus is saying. He's saying, you've got all this other stuff going on. You're carrying all this other stuff.
That's stuff.
Let's come back to your purpose.
Yeah.
Let's come back to what I put you on the planet to do.
Yeah.
Let's start again there. Yeah. Lehan, we're pretty much out of time. We need to land this. What's the call to action? What's the last 5% that you want to give to people out there who are dealing with stress and have hopefully learned a few things today? What do they do next? What's the call to action?
Well, I think it's very important that you start something now, right? So I think when you're going to start something, you need to start it now.
Excellent.
So the first thing I'd say is go and be very clear on the definitions. So we've spoken about a couple of definitions. So there's some terminology we throw around. Go and find out what's the true meaning of stress, what's the true meaning of pressure. Then maybe think about what in your life do you currently call stress, and what shouldn't be called stress, but it's just pressure that you can deal with. The next thing I'd say is find out what is rumination you go to, and what are the things that you're avoiding as a consequence.
Nice. Yeah.
And what can you put in place to deal with those things? And maybe a useful thing is going back to those toolboxes is it's a very simple process. And what I find is people quite often want me to tell them, what should I put in the toolbox? My thing is that entirely depends on what your function and your mission in this world is. You need to figure that out. Whether you come to growth track or any of that sort of things that the church offers or anywhere else, is go and really think about what is it that I'm supposed to do that's beyond my job. What's my mission, not my job? And then think, what's in my building toolbox? What's in my maintenance toolbox? And what is in my repair toolbox? And find them. If you don't have those, put them in place. Go and find the mentors. Go and find the people you can go to. Find out is there a person that you can connect with in church, at work, that you can talk to. Quite often, I think part of our toolbox should be, where can I add value to someone or some people? Because we often forget that. We're quite introspective in what is it that I need, instead of what is it that I need to do that will actually be good for me as well. Right. So I think go and write down those toolboxes. Really work on them and figure out what is it that I need to put on my toolboxes, and who, not just what.
Lehan, fantastic. Really helpful, man. We covered some ground today.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you for your expertise and your insight, and a great call to action with some clear steps. And that was really very, very helpful. It's been great. Hope you guys have enjoyed this, and I really encourage you to tune in for more of this as we continue on this journey. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening today. If this has raised something for you, 1737 is the number of a counselling number that you can text, that you can call if you need immediate support. You can also contact your local pastor if you need support. And then if you need some counselling at elimchristiancentre.org.nz. Love to support you on your journey. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time.